Will we be following standing orders?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, Mr Chair. Good morning, committee members. Thank you for inviting me to the committee. At the table today, I have Ian Rennie, the Treasury Secretary, and Struan Little, a man who has helped piece together more budgets than just about any other living New Zealander. If the Chair permits, I will make some introductory remarks. As set out in the Fiscal Strategy Report, the key elements of the government's fiscal strategy are to reduce core Crown expenses towards 30% of GDP, to return the headline operating balance measure to surplus, to put net core Crown debt as a percentage of GDP on a downward trajectory towards 40% and keep it below that in the longer term. Members are aware that Treasury's recommended net debt ceiling is 50% of GDP, and that has had bipartisan support. We are aiming for 40% because the ceiling should never be the target. History shows that one economic shock on its own can push debt up by 20% of GDP, and we have to allow for that. That is precisely the point of having moderate amounts of debt, so debt can increase significantly in a crisis or a shock. But once that buffer is used, it has to be restored again, otherwise debt just ratchets up and up. Members will also be aware that the fiscal track, while improving in an absolute sense, has been revised downwards over several forecasts. These revisions have been driven by economic factors outside the government's control. They are factors that would have impacted whoever was sitting in the chair as the Minister of Finance at the time, including in the most recent update by the imposition of new US tariffs and the resulting global uncertainty and its impacts for international growth projections. So in the face of that, the question is, what can the government do? Well, what the government can do is control its discretionary spending in the budget, and we have done that. Since the pre-election fiscal update, our budget packages and allowance changes have improved the operating balance by $2.3 billion compared to what it otherwise would have been. The latest forecasts show core Crown expenses falling over the forecast period, reaching 30.9% of GDP by 28-29, so well on the way to our 30% target. The budget forecasts also show Obergalics gradually improving after 25-26, returning to a modest surplus of $0.2 billion by the end of the forecast period. And they show the debt curve bending down over the forecast period, from going up to 46% of GDP to beginning to go down. It's instructive, I think, members to consider the choices that the government has been able to make. And we have conducted an exercise in my office to see what would have happened if we hadn't delivered the savings packages in last year's budget and this year's budget, savings which have been questioned by opposition members in many instances. Taking that exercise, in the absence of the savings packages in last year's budget and this year's budget, we would be looking at significantly larger deficits and significantly more debt. For example, in the 25-26 year, while we are currently forecasting a deficit of around $12 billion, that number would be $23.4 billion if it weren't for the government's savings drives. In that 25-26 year, whereas we're forecasting debt at 43.9%, it would be 47.7%. That effect would continue throughout the forecast period, meaning that by the 26-27 fiscal year, we would blow the debt ceiling and be at 51.7%, and it would continue to climb, going to 53.8% and then 55% in subsequent years, with the deficit position continuing into the forecast period. My point is a simple one, members, which is that New Zealand's economy, as have many economies around the world, has gone through a very challenging period, and we must respond to that, but we cannot take responsibility for all of those impacts. What we can take responsibility for are our choices, and I believe that the government has made prudent choices in light of the global economic conditions we face. Another thing that the government can do and must do is introduce growth-enhancing policies that result in a larger economy and therefore a stronger set of books and stronger living standards for New Zealanders. Those changes, in some instances, deliver immediately and in the short term. In other instances, they are required to set the foundations for better long-term productivity and growth. In this year's budget, for example, we introduced the Investment Boost policy, which allows New Zealand businesses to immediately deduct 20% of the cost of qualifying assets on top of depreciation. That increases after-tax returns on investment and will help lift New Zealand's capital stock, GDP and wages. And I note and acknowledge the support from members around the table for that policy. The budget also included a number of other growth-enhancing measures, not all of which are reflected yet in the Treasury forecasts. They include our changes to grow New Zealanders' KiwiSaver balances, which should increase the amount of investment available in New Zealand for New Zealand assets and financial instruments. They include our changes to introduce Invest New Zealand to attract a higher rate of overseas capital into our firms and enterprises. They include substantive and well thought through changes to our education settings to ensure that more young people, particularly those with additional learning needs, receive the support they need early in order that they can achieve and contribute more to our economy in the longer run. They include our ongoing commitment to infrastructure investment, ensuring that infrastructure funding is tied to productivity-enhancing infrastructure assets, our changes to ensure that the Crown-funded research, science and technology system is better tied to the commercial needs of our firms and industries, ongoing work to reform the Resource Management Act to free up development, our decision to provide additional funding to Elevate New Zealand. Collectively, these choices matter. It is the position of Treasury to be very conservative before reflecting potential growth impacts in their forecasts. However, I am optimistic and confident that by continuing this focus on growth-enhancing initiatives, we will see New Zealand's economic position recover over these next 4 years and into the future. I will leave it there and say that I am happy to take the committee's questions.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to the Honourable.
Well, that feels like a bit of a long start up.
Okay, am I on mute or am I?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. Right. Okay, so what did I get from that? I got a bunch of numbers, which is, good. She should be able to answer questions relating to the debt ceiling. She should be able to answer questions relating to projections of where the budget's going to go and what it's going to result in. She should be able to answer questions on the economic impacts of the policies. So these are the things that I'm looking for, right? She should be able to answer those questions. If she can't, I'll point that out.
Okay. And some of the footwear that people think Nicola wears?
Huh?
I bet she wears steel-capped boots. Not sure if that's you or Nicola Willis, or maybe both.
I wear steel-cap boots. I don't know about her.
I do as well. Depending what type of footwear, often they are the steel caps, but they're the ones that've got the support for the ankles.
Depends if I'm operating a chainsaw or not.
Oh, well, when you operate a chainsaw, you should definitely be wearing steel caps.
Yes, you should.
Yeah. Okay, let's kick it off. Barbara Edmonds.
Barbara Edmonds.
Good morning, Minister. Just want to acknowledge Dominic Stevens and Lani Fruit. This will be your last estimates hearing with us. Thank you very much for your service to the Treasury. Minister, this year's budget included a return of funding of $144 million from the Reserve Bank. Through Official Information Act requests, your office sought a meeting with the previous Reserve Bank Governor on the 5th of February, then the 7th of February, and then the 10th of February. The Reserve Bank Governor at the time, Adrian Orr, declined to meet due to the blackouts that occurred during the Monetary Committee stages. A meeting was therefore held on the 24th of February with the Reserve Bank Governor at the time, Adrian Orr, the Chairperson, Professor Neil Quigley, and the Deputy Governor at the time as well. As well as the funding for the RBNZ, the Acting Reserve Bank Governor on the 8th of May in this committee confirmed that you also discussed a review of the capital requirements. Adrian Orr also resigned on the 5th of March. In the meeting on the 24th of February, did you at all indicate to the then Governor, Adrian Orr, that the decisions on the Reserve Bank's funding could be affected by the Reserve Bank's position or review of the capital requirement rules?
No, I did not. I have previously confirmed that at that meeting there were 3 key topics which were discussed. The first was the Reserve Bank's progress on implementing recommendations following the Commerce Commission's review into banking competition and my letter of expectations to the Reserve Bank. That took up quite some time in the meeting. The second item that was discussed was the capital adequacy ratios and whether or not the Reserve Bank was seeing some of the impacts that had been predicted when they chose to increase those ratios in 2019. The third topic, discussed more briefly, was the funding review. As the member will be aware, the funding agreement between the Reserve Bank and the Minister of Finance is a discussion that occurs between the Reserve Bank Board and me, and that was covered in the meeting.
It's become apparent that Adrian Orr's resignation was because of those discussions on the 24th of February. At the time of his resignation, did you know the reasons for his resignation?
Well, the Reserve Bank Board is the employer of the Reserve Bank Governor. And so at all times, I have been, I think, appropriately careful not to insert myself into that employment relationship. I was advised on the 24th by Treasury Secretary Ian Rennie that employment discussions had commenced between the Reserve Bank Board and the Reserve Bank Governor. And while it was possible for me at the time to speculate on a number of issues which could have contributed to those discussions, I have judged it prudent not to do so, noting that the Reserve Bank Board ultimately formed an exit agreement with the Reserve Bank Governor and has been best placed to speak about that.
So you were aware of his resignation, but you're also aware of speculation. What was your speculation?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
It's one thing to link the funding of the Reserve Bank to the budget, but speculating on an employee of an independent Crown entity, I don't see how it's relevant to this environment.
Yeah, no.
I'm speaking to her response, which is around.
Well, let's keep it on the estimates, not on speculation about the former Reserve Bank Governor's resignation last financial year. Okay. Well, it's a pretty tenuous link. Let's get back to the budget. Let's get back to the budget.
Member Edmonds made an assumption, which is not what I said. I was informed on the 24th that employment discussions had commenced. As to the reasoning for those, It is purely the member speculation that the cause of that was the funding agreement. As has been clarified by the Reserve Bank subsequently in Official Information Act requests, they have formed the view that disagreements between the board and the Reserve Bank governor and the government over the level of funding that the Reserve Bank required had contributed to those employment discussions.
Minister, are you aware of Section 171 of the Reserve Bank Act that safeguards the independence of the Reserve Bank?
Yes, I am, and I take it very seriously, which is why I have judged it is not appropriate for me to speculate on the comings and goings of the employment arrangements between the Reserve Bank board and its governor.
Okay. Besides the Act, are you aware that one of the key tenets for the independence of a central bank, as supported by both the IMF and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is that the Reserve Bank has budgetary independence from the legislature? Why does your funding agreement with the Reserve Bank have a new clause, paragraph 7, that requires a return of underspends, a clause that is not in any funding agreement between the Reserve Bank and Grant Robertson, Bill English or Michael Cullen? Therefore, effectively, your 5-year funding agreement is actually an annual funding agreement.
Well, I reject the member's characterisation. It has been a long-standing feature of New Zealand's Reserve Bank framework that funding for the Reserve Bank is negotiated between the Finance Minister and the board. This is common sense in the sense that the government ultimately needs to take control of its own fiscal strategy and needs to ensure that the funding it provides to the Reserve Bank is sufficient to carry out its statutory functions, but beyond that has discretionary choices about the level of funding. I sought throughout the funding agreement discussions to ensure that we had a clear view that the funding being provided was sufficient for the Reserve Bank to carry out its statutory functions. I became aware during those discussions that the Reserve Bank had engaged in a practice where it was bringing forward underspends, which had the effect of ramping up its effective budget out of line with the funding agreements that had been set. I have been given confidence by both the Reserve Bank board and the Treasury that the level of funding we have provided is sufficient for the Reserve Bank to carry out its statutory functions. In fact, the Treasury advised me that we could agree to a lesser amount of funding and be satisfied that those functions could be carried out. However, I listened to the submissions from the Reserve Bank board, who were of the view that the level of funding that we eventually struck was appropriate and would give them greater confidence in their ability to carry it out in functions.
So why are you
Okay, last supplementary, and then we're going to move on to close order.
Why are you the only finance minister who has ever had this particular clause, which effectively makes a 5-year funding agreement a 1-year funding agreement? Because I'm pretty sure Grant Robertson, Bill English, Michael Cullen would have the same views around efficiencies. However, you are the only finance minister that has that clause.
Well, that doesn't reflect my understanding. I think that there was actually not necessarily a view that the Reserve Bank was able to carry over funding beyond what had been agreed to in the 5-year funding agreement. Perhaps I'll ask Ian Rennie, the Treasury Secretary.
I've got all the agreements here.
I will ask the Treasury Secretary to address this point.
Mr. Rennie to respond, and then we're going to move to the next
I think
question.
that the way it's been characterised by the member doesn't reflect necessarily the facts of the case.
Thank you. If you can clarify that.
So I think there's points. One is to come back to actually this the agreement between the minister and the board is with the full agreement of the board, and the board has at no stage given advice that they are unhappy about this provision. I think the second point is in the course of very lengthy discussions with the Reserve Bank around the funding agreement, there were advice sought by both the Treasury and Reserve Bank about this issue of can you carry forward underspends, etc. And that legal advice was somewhat unclear, and that's why the position was made clear in this funding agreement. And it was, and that was something that the Reserve Bank sought clarity of through our engagements.
Which is to say that it's not actually clear that the Reserve Bank were ever able to carry forward underspends in the way that they did, per the law as it stood. That had become their practice over the past 5 years, but there was dispute as to whether or not they were legally able to do that. So we sought to clarify that in the terms of the agreement going forward.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go.
There's one more question.
Well, we've had 7, but anyway, one more.
So do you accept any responsibility at all for the resignation of the Reserve Bank Governor, Adrian Orr?
No, the Reserve Bank Governor is responsible for his own resignation.
Yeah, okay. Again, let's get...
Okay, you learn something new every day. I didn't know about this funding thing about, was it underfunds being carried forward into future financial years?
That sounds like something we ought to be concerned about.
Well, yeah, considering it's something that is often said that people would rather have happen than having, this is particularly a bitch and moan people make about local councils, particularly usually about this time of year they're doing what they would call spend the money before the end of the financial year budget spends. And it's like, sort of thing there. And because for local councils, they can't carry underfunds from previous years into future budgets. It's a use it or lose it sort of system. And I'm wondering, is Nicola enforcing that use it or lose it sort of system onto the Reserve Bank, which by the sounds of it has previously done that, whether they were legally allowed to do that or not, but have done it.
Now that is interesting and concerning, but it's interesting, and I want to look more into it when I have the time to do so.
Because I do know that that is something that is often seen as a wish in an accounting sense that could exist. Now, I do know the good thing about councils is that they have 10-year budgets.
Yep.
So there is flexibility that you can spread those costs or the projected spend for the rates as you bill out to your ratepayers over a 10-year period, because your budget's set over 10 years, but it's what's in the annual plan of the budgets is where it becomes a bit airy-fairy, or where you've got that very tight deadline. But that's something which I do believe should be, is that if you don't spend the money in one budget, should you be allowed to carry over into the next budget as excess cash? That means you save yourself asking more money in future budgets.
I mean, I would go with yes, but I would like to ask an economist what they think of such a thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have dial Craig Rennie.
Yeah, Craig! Get on my... Where's my phone? 0800 Craig!
0800 Rennie? Yep. I think 0800 Rennie might be a better one than 0800 Craig. Hey, let's see if we can get that 0800 number. Okay, let's continue on with